When I first started looking at Mexico, one of the things I heard was it's very hard to find design. It's very hard to find reverse engineering. I heard that in Monterrey, where they've got the auto industry. When I come to Guadalajara, it turns out they do have this. But the people that I'm speaking to from Caterpillar and the Monterrey people and the Saltillo people don't do it. So they say it doesn't, it doesn't exist. But when I come down here, yeah, it exists.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Altium On Track podcast. I'm your host, Zach Peterson. Today, we're speaking with Andrew Hupert, professor at Holt University and a supply chain consultant. He's spent 20 years in Asia. He's recently moved over to Mexico, and he thinks that you should do the same. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great to be here, Zach. Thanks for having me.
So we don't have a lot of supply chain people, or maybe not enough supply chain people on the show. But given all the events of the past couple years, I think someone like yourself is very interesting to have on the show because you work beyond just electronics. So maybe if you could tell us all what you do and a little bit about your background, that would be very helpful.
Okay. My main job is cross-cultural negotiation. That's what I teach, and that is how I do my job. Most of my time in Asia, when I wasn't teaching business school, I was training purchasing teams at places like Siemens, Philips, some semiconductor companies, a lot of others you've never heard of. But I was training Western sourcers and Western procurement teams to interact with Chinese suppliers. So that's how from 2002 to 2012, I was living in Shanghai and I was teaching at NYU, the business school, and I was training purchasing teams. After 2012, I started to branch out a little bit. I spent some time in Thailand, spent some time in Vietnam, doing much the same thing. Everything was going along just swimmingly till COVID hit, and in one fell swoop, I lost both. Between that and the trade war, I lost both my careers. I lost my China specialty, became devalued, and teaching sort of went lowest common denominator online. So I did what a lot of people did after COVID, sort of reshuffle the deck. I didn't really start anything radically new. I just started following my own advice. I did the business environment analysis that I teach people to do. I looked at the strengths and weaknesses of different supply chains and different business environments around the world. And I chose Mexico. I thought that Mexico's got some tremendous advantages, especially for small and medium-sized enterprises right now. And that's really my specialty. So I'm over here sort of paving the road, clearing the road to bring over my old clients from China who, in my opinion, are going to have a lot of trouble completing their business mission if they stay in China and try to sell to the United States. And we can talk about why, but I don't think that's going to come as a big shock to many of your listeners.
Well, sure. I think anybody that's listening and hears, ex-China is going to come up with 2 or 3 different reasons that make sense for them. But I think probably the bigger question is why Mexico and why maybe Latin America more broadly. We've actually talked with someone else on the show. His name is Case Engelin, and they have a facility in Taiwan, and then they have a facility in Colombia. And so Latin America more broadly might seem like a good opportunity if you're trying to geographically diversify your supply chain and your manufacturing base.
Right now, I am looking at the major challenge to any cross-border business as government regulation. Okay, I see compliance costs are becoming unmanageable. Logistics is becoming more unpredictable and more difficult, and regulations are, there's a transaction risk that we didn't have before 2018 when our trade war with China started. Mexico is uniquely positioned because of, you can call it NAFTA 2, the real name is USMCA, the US, Mexico, Canada agreement. Here in Mexico, we call it TMEC. But that puts Mexico top of the list as far as production sites, as far as emerging market candidates for large scale factories and large scale production. So yeah, Latin America has a lot to offer. Colombia is actually the other thing I look at, the other entity I pay attention to for production. Latin America has a lot to offer in terms of raw materials and resources, but Mexico, Colombia, I don't know who else. I guess that's really it. Have a production base that is suitable for the U.S. The only difference, the key difference for me is Mexico is part of that trade agreement, the USMCA, NAFTA 2, and Mexico has the physical border, a 2,000-mile physical border with the United States, 40 official ports of entry. Worst comes to worst, you can drive a pickup truck to your factory and get your stuff. And that was the big frustration during the second half of COVID when you couldn't unload a boat.
Right. I remember hearing about a lot of shipping container vessels
Yeah,
that were like stuck, just parked outside of the LA port.
parked outside of LA and then parked outside of Shanghai.
Right.
It was a parking lot for boats. And I don't expect that to happen again because of COVID, but A, that's a possibility. And B, as we'll discuss, there are other things that could disrupt shipping. And
Sure.
once that happens, the first time it happened, I think it was 2021, when it first happened, everyone was like, this is shocking. We'll all pull together, we'll figure this out. But 2023, 2024, suppliers and partners and customers aren't going to be quite as forgiving. This is in the market now. We know that there are going to be logistics problems, or potentially. We know that the U.S. and China are, in a state of some degree of hostility with one another, and that has the potential to disrupt shipping. So Mexico has a good trade agreement with the United States. In my opinion, it's going to be the last trade agreement the United States signs for quite some time. It's got the facilities, it's got the educated, well-trained workforce. There are problems with Mexico, and we'll talk about all of that. But because of the proximity, because of the favorable regulatory environment between the United States and Mexico, and the cost base of producing in Mexico, I think there's a lot to look at here.
Yeah, and there's a lot to unpack in what you just described. But you mentioned the trade agreement aspect, which I think is probably one of the last things people have thought about when they're looking at where to produce, especially in maybe moderate volume, where the trade issue can create a real cost differential between two different locations.
You got to keep
Why is
20% tariff on a lot of goods coming out of China. And
yes,
I don't
yes.
think that's going to go away anytime soon. So that 20% right there, it equalizes a lot of the disadvantages of having to move production. That's a hefty number.
So you mentioned that you think the trade agreement with Mexico is probably the last one the U.S. will sign. But if companies are looking elsewhere in Latin America, do you think there would ever be any impetus to maybe develop a similar trade agreement, like maybe with Colombia?
There is for me. I'm a big fan of that. And if anyone at the the trade, who does trade agreements? If there's anyone at Commerce, or if there's anyone from the Biden administration listening, yeah, we should definitely be extending the USMCA. The issue, though, Zach, and remember, I'm a negotiator, and this is what I do. I train negotiators. The issue here is that's not within my power to negotiate. That's not a variable for me. It's a given. It's part of the environment. So yes, I would love to see Nicaragua and Colombia and Paraguay and Peru, but I don't think it's going to happen. There's a possibility of Colombia. I've never been to Colombia. I've got to become clean here. I don't know Colombia that well, but on paper, when I do my business environment analysis, Colombia looks good to me. But Colombia,
I see.
I would definitely like to see USMCA extended to include Colombia and possibly Panama, possibly Peru. But again, that's a great thing for business people to discuss. I don't think government people are discussing that.
Sure, that's understandable. So in terms of the business environment in Mexico and probably elsewhere in Latin America, what are some of the challenges for any company that wants to move some of their supply chain to Mexico, or maybe all of their supply chain to Mexico? Because when we talk electronics manufacturing, right, it's more than just the circuit boards and the assembly. I mean, there's plastics, there's mechanical fasteners, there's sheet metal. I mean, wire and cables, and the list goes on and on.
And design and software too, which
Sure,
is,
yeah.
I'm plugging. I'm in Guadalajara at the moment, so I'm sort of plugging the work I'm doing right now. Yeah, I'm meeting with a lot of design people, and I'm meeting with a lot of software people because Guadalajara is in the process of turning itself into a software and design center. As far as supply chain, as far as electronics in Mexico, there's good news and bad news. Let's start with the challenges, and the first challenge is supply chain and sourcing. I just had a long conversation with a designer this past week. He said all of the pieces exist in Mexico. You can find the design, you can find parts, you can find processors, but the problem is they're not in the same place and not everyone knows where they are. In other words, if you want something designed, you'll come to Guadalajara. They can do the reverse engineering. They can do the 3D prototypes. They can do look and feel. They can do the complete design. I said, where do you have it produced? He said, China. I said, wait a minute, that's not going to work. Where in Mexico can we have this done? I said, well, you can go to Querétaro for this sort of metal processing, and you can go to León for this, I think. And I contrast that with my conversations in Shenzhen, where if I went to, I'm holding up my little Bluetooth mouse. If I went to a factory, not a designer, not a consultant, if I just showed up at the factory and said, I want to produce this, but I don't know how to do it, by the time I got up and left the meeting from that factory manager in Shenzhen, he would have arranged my entire sourcing plan. I might not have the molds. I might not have the intellectual property. I might be stuck with him forever. That's a different issue. But he would know by the end of business that day where to source everything. That is something that is a challenge here in Mexico. So things take a little bit longer to arrange for just that reason. Also, at the very high end, at the semiconductor level, you're not really going to find, you might not find the talent in Mexico that you would be able to access in Asia.
This is really interesting because, it sounds like in Shenzhen, if you were to talk to that same person, they have a list of people in their back pocket that they know they can call. I can call this company for the design, this company for the plastic, the enclosure, so on and so forth. And they just have this list probably because they deal with it so much. Is that fair to say? It's because they have to deal with it so much that they've been like economically forced into having that list ready to go on a moment's notice?
It's also a matter of policy and a matter of culture. On a policy level, China put all the manufacturing in one place. This was a plan. The whole rise of China from, when I first started going to China in 1996, because I'm old. So when I first went to China, there was a Guangdong Special Economic Zone, and
Okay.
or Shenzhen Special. It was a special economic zone, and you needed a special. There was a special passport to get in. You couldn't leave the zone, and they were already building and rehabilitating older factories. This was always the plan, to put everything in one place. Now, in addition, Chinese culture, Chinese business culture, puts a premium on guanxi, on your connections. You're supposed to have really good networks. That for a Chinese business person, that is just a sign of competence. They like that, and this predates WeChat and all the social networks. When I first went to China, it was pre-social media, and it was still a big deal. I worked for an electronics company on the ground in like 2002, and I was introduced to someone who said he used to be in the army. He has very, very good connections. That was his qualification for being one of the senior partners. He had very good
He just knew
connections.
people.
He knew people who knew people. Mexico is just the opposite. Mexico, smart people keep their mouths shut. It's a family business. Culturally speaking, business here was organized around family units. The father, the patron, ran the business. All decisions went through him. And if you're a smart business person, you present the boss with the information he needs, and that's it. He makes the decisions. So the idea of building a really broad network is more of a family thing or a relationship. It's a pure relationship thing here in Mexico, whereas in China, it's more of a business thing. So in Mexico, once you break into that network, everyone knows everyone. But if you're an outsider, you're an outsider.
That's really interesting because I think if you think about what was happening with electronics production, 40 years ago, everybody had like a captive production or supply chain. And so because of that, I think at some point everyone was reinventing the wheel as far as what they had to build and the specialty. And so at some point it made sense to have like EMS companies that just were good at production and to build out that kind of network like that. And it doesn't sound like that same culture of specialization and building these kind of highly specialized services really exists in Mexico. Is that a fair way to look at it?
Mexico's got multiple economies. At the SME level, at the small and medium sized enterprises, you've got two types of Mexican business. One is the craft oriented, simple material, non electronics business. They make furniture. They make tables and chairs. That's the example I'm always given. They're very, very good at what they do. They put a premium on craftsmanship. They do not put a premium on production and efficiency. So when you come to Mexico, the level of workmanship is very, very high. The level of project management is very, very low. And this is, one of the things I'm here for. This someone is going to develop this. I'm putting it together. There are other people who are putting together these networks that are, in Asia and in China, these networks were just sort of part of the environment they were given. Here, there is a great deal. It's siloed. That's the expression the term I use. So someone in Guadalajara will know everything about Guadalajara, but he won't know anything about what's happening in León, a few hundred miles to the west, where they're doing all the electronics production for medical devices, or in Querétaro, where they're doing all the sophisticated electronics for the aerospace industry, or along the border where they're making cars and autos. Well, I mean, you know better than I. Nowadays, a car is just a series of electronics devices with wheels. So the know-how is here, but it is siloed within companies and within cities, or within regions. So every region has its own, is developing its own specialty. But what hasn't happened yet is that we haven't built, there isn't the Alibaba of Mexico. This is like the holy grail for people I talk to. Everyone wants the Alibaba of Alibaba.com of Mexico, and it doesn't exist, and I don't know if it ever will. So
That was one thing I was just wondering is the challenge because these like pervasive marketplaces where anybody can join and offer products and services don't exist. And you brought up Alibaba of Mexico. I think if you had that, or like the DigiKey of Mexico, if you want to focus specifically on electronics, and you can go into other industries as well, I think that would make a lot of sense. But I wonder if that kind of service is the type of thing where if you build it, they will come. And if there's a cultural barrier to that kind of networking in among different players in a particular industry, maybe if you build it, they won't come.
the customers will come. Will the factory? Will the factories come? That
That's
brings us
what I mean. Yeah.
that brings us to another issue. Right now, there is not that much contract manufacturing in Mexico, and the contract manufacturing that exists is like Flextronics. They're coming from overseas. They're coming from the U.S. and more they're coming from China, which is going to be the wild card here, because that might fix things in a way we don't want them to be fixed. But it's a possibility. There isn't a native Mexican version of Foxconn or
Hmm.
Flextronics. It's all coming from overseas. They don't particularly like that business. I mentioned before there were multiple economies. Let's switch the focus to the big advanced production. These are well, let's use the auto industry because that's really what built this kind of business in Mexico. The American automakers have been producing in Mexico for like 70 or 80 years. It goes way back. An auto factory in Mexico looks just like an auto factory in the United States that happens to be in Mexico. It looks the same. They have ISO 9000, 9001, whatever ISO you want. They all talk about being Six Sigma black belts and following the Toyota way or the Caterpillar way or the GM way, and they're really into it. They are on the same. A Mexican factory manager is on the same org chart as HQ, which is a huge operational difference from trying to build in China, where you got a 12-hour time difference and a big culture gap. Here it's we're in. I'm talking to you from Mexico. From Mexico, we're in the same time zone pretty much. In the old days, one of us would be losing sleep right now if I
Hmm.
were in China because there's a 12-hour or 11-hour time difference. So these American or these international multinational companies, let me do that again. These multinational factories that are being built now are cutting edge. They are really, really good at what they do, but their supply chain is not dependent on Mexico. Their supply chain is global. So they're bringing in containers of everything they need, and it is not having a huge impact on the contract manufacturing business in Mexico. When the Chinese come in, that may change. It may not change. That remains to be seen. But so far, the contract manufacturing that does exist here is large scale for servicing that multinational, that sophisticated, large scale multinational production effort. So it's not working its way down. You can't go shopping for electronic parts like you could in China.
I wonder if it would take like a Foxconn or a TTM to come in and set up shop with electronics production and probably a lot of other ancillary components that go into electronics assemblies as well to really drive the native group of companies to get out of that siloing that they do. I think on some level I understand it because it's kind of this mentality of like, we worked hard to build our relationships and our capacity and our capabilities. And we don't want to interface with anybody else because someone else might take that from us. So I kind of get that mentality. But at some point, if you really want to scale, you have to team up with other companies and you have to develop those supplier relationships.
I agree with you. I feel the same way. Um, Unfortunately, a lot of Mexican factory owners do not yet, but I'm pretty sure that that tide is turning. It's turning here a little bit because we have, on the design side. When I first started looking at Mexico, one of the things I heard was it's very hard to find design. It's very hard to find reverse engineering. I heard that in Monterrey, where they've got the auto industry. When I come to Guadalajara, it turns out they do have this. But the people that I'm speaking to from Caterpillar and the Monterrey people and the Saltillo people don't do it. So they say it doesn't, it doesn't exist. But when I come down here, yeah, it exists. That's who I had lunch with the other day. I had lunch with a guy who does reverse engineering and 3D prototypes. So someone's going to put the pieces together. It might end up being me or someone like me, or it could be Foxconn and Flextronics and Plantronics, or it could be the next gen of Mexican entrepreneurs.
Yeah, that's another kind of wild card here is if the next generation of entrepreneurs maybe see what happens in other countries and other cultures, and then they say, hey, getting out of your silo is actually very valuable, especially if you're running a manufacturing operation and you want to scale it. And then
Yes.
they start to undergo that, networking and marketing kind of, initiative to try and link all these different companies together and eventually maybe become that broker that knows where all those different services are and can work with an OEM, let's say, or maybe a company that wants to produce at moderate volume in Mexico and provide all those solutions.
Well, that brings up an interesting point. The whole concept of OEM and contract manufacturing is a little bit different here. When
Okay.
Mexicans talk about OEM, it looks to me a lot like a wholly owned subsidiary. There's a little bit of a difference in the phrasing. They don't really like until up till recently, up till now, they haven't really liked contract manufacturing because it's contrary to the two ways they do business. From a from the craftsman workshop type type setup, they don't like it because it's too variable. And from they say no, I don't want to ramp up, and they'll look you right in the eye and say no, I don't want any more business, which coming from Asia is very strange to hear, but here they have more of a
Coming from America, it's very strange to hear.
from America too. But they have that craftsman approach and the family business approach. On the other extreme, I'm talking to these factory managers who could definitely do it, but these guys were trained by General Motors or they were trained by Caterpillar. If they don't have an entire end-to-end production plan, including a bill of materials and a budget and sourcing, they'll walk away. They say, no, you don't have a product. You've got you're a marketer, you're not a producer. And again, coming from the north, coming where I was recently, coming from Monterrey, that's the insult. You're not a manufacturer, you're a marketer. In Asia, that's okay. It's actually good. They like that because it enables them to use their network to do all the design work. In Mexico, they don't like that because they're basically Detroit or Irving, Texas, or they're trained to be factory managers. They're not trained to be marketers. Or
So
CEOs.
that I guess that puts the burden on the customer. If it's, let's say it's a small medium business, they want to produce moderate volume assemblies in Mexico, they have to go through and find all of those different people, figure out the logistics. How are you going to get, let's say it's boards. How are you going to get boards from one factory over to the assembler? How are you going to get the chips over there? Where are you going to get the plastics, the fasteners, the cables, all of that stuff?
Okay, true, but with one added twist. You're expected to do the assembly or production work yourself. Mexico,
Oh,
yeah, Mexico is set up to build factories.
okay.
So that's a big, big difference. When you go to you talk about entering the Mexican market for production. They are going to ask you how big your factory, how much space you need, how many square feet you need for your factory, and that's what it's set up for. Like I said, Flextronics is here in this town, and there's a lot of design work in this town. They have they've been the people who've traditionally done design for products, including electronics, have done the design here and then sent the work over to Taiwan or China for production. That is changing, but the assumption is still that you will set up your own factory, at
I
least for
see. I
assembly.
see.
At least for assembly. And Mexico is set up for that. They have. I told you about the USMCA, the new NAFTA. Well, Mexico has something on the other side called EMECs, and if you want to bring in equipment, you want to bring in materials, you want to bring in raw materials or components, you can bring all of it in duty free,
I
provided
see.
provided you ship it out. They don't
Whatever
want.
you make, you have to ship it out.
Hmm? Sorry,
Whatever you make, you have to ship it out.
all for export. They don't want you selling into the Mexican market. Sometimes it's called a shelter organization, a shelter system, because they have a set of laws that makes everything you do tariff free, low or no duty, or rebate the value added tax that you have to pay. It's set up for the production that gets exported. So Mexico.
That's very strange because I mean, if you're producing, let's say you're producing the next, I'll use the iPhone. We always use that as an example. Let's say you're producing the next iPhone, like you want to sell that internationally. Wouldn't you want to sell some of those to Mexican citizens? I mean,
You can,
even if you produce it here.
you can, but you'll be paying a tariff, or you'll be paying duties. I shouldn't say tariff. You'll be paying duties on all the materials, just like a regular product. This is an incentive. They like export for Mexico, and this could be a good lead into Mexican government policy. The Mexican government likes high employment. They like new technology, and they like protecting their domestic market. So
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, it's all about protecting the domestic manufacturer who is going to be allowed to sell locally. So, you American company that's producing all these, electronic devices, you got to ship them out
yep.
because there might be a Mexican producer that's producing the same thing, and we want to make sure Mexican money gets spent on something produced in Mexico and keeps the money in the economy.
That's the logic that governs Mexico. Mexico is much more willing to adjust the market. They nationalize stuff. They have a lot of policies that are not very pro-business at the national level. On the state and municipal level, they're much more pro industry and much more pro business, and that's where the interesting things are happening. But that leads to more of this siloing, because the infrastructure in Monterrey is very very different than the infrastructure and the legal structure in places like Lyon, where it's a little bit rougher.
I see.
So
I
there's a
see.
lot of there's a lot of variance from different business centers in Mexico.
Well, I suppose if you're planning to geographically diversify your electronics manufacturing base and supply chain, initially Mexico looks really cool because it's got, water on both sides of the country. So shipping is easier. And
Mm-hmm.
then, of course, you've got one big, huge end market just to the north of you, United States,
The
and then, of
biggest.
course, Canada.
Yep.
But a lot of these challenges really have to play into the business strategy if that's really going to be your plan. It sounds like this is only going to be something where maybe it's an American company selling in the American market that is trying to diversify themselves away from whatever centralized situation they're in Asia. And maybe that's the strategy that makes the most sense. from a
Well,
business standpoint?
you've got three things to consider. Yes, for simple answer, yes. Number one, you don't have to move. You're not required to move 100% of your production out of China or out of Asia into Mexico.
Sure.
Mexico has, because of the cost basis here, it still makes sense as a transshipment point. It still makes sense as for assembly and packaging and processing and shipping.
So,
Um,
so maybe you do the boards in China and you ship the semiconductors from the US to your assembly plant in Mexico. You assemble it in Mexico, then you export it back to the US and Europe and Australia or wherever else.
that's one possibility. The second
Okay.
possibility that I'm just starting to see, and I'm very interested in this one. Don't forget, you've got a very sophisticated production and electronics design base in the United States. So in
Sure.
places like Texas, where TSMC is setting up in Arizona, but places like Texas and Arizona and California are also right across the border, and there is a lot of hopscotch. You go back and forth. Mexico is really good at design, really good at assembly. They've got the right cost structure. Mexico has, there are a lot of problems with the infrastructure in Mexico, but roads, airports, rail, and regular ports are not the problem. It's very easy to ship. It's very easy to move stuff around. And all the production centers you see here in Mexico are all on major highways. And if you're making in Monterrey, we're talking about 2 hours to Laredo. I think it's only 2 hours, or to Brownsville. It's 2 hours to the border. And if you Tijuana and Ciudad Juarez, they're even closer. So and they've got laws so that the trucks get preferential treatment. They can just drive across. There's a zone within 25 miles of the border on either side, and the trucks don't really have to stop. So it's set up for this. Mexico is set up for this kind of production. But the two caveats are: one, you need your own factory, and two, you have to know where stuff is.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense.
So the scenarios I'm discussing with people are: one, moving, transitioning gradually into a Mexico production base. So you're not just pulling up stakes. You're not burning your factory in China or in Vietnam to the ground. You're still going to import components, but the lower tech stuff can be done probably better here in Mexico. So you can transition. The other thing that we can use Mexico for is the shift from just-in-time inventory management to just-in-case inventory management. And you can warehouse and store and accumulate and keep your stock here in Mexico, so that if those boats stop moving between Ningbo and Los Angeles, you can still do business. You won't have empty shelves at your customer store, like we saw during I think it was 21, during the shipping
Yeah,
crisis.
makes
And
sense.
then eventually ramp up your Mexican production.
Yeah. I think maybe the other instance here is, you're right. I think companies aren't totally, burning their factories to the ground, as you said, in Asia. But if they're planning something new and they're going to keep that other factory online, maybe
Yes,
this is a location that makes a lot of sense for some of the reasons you cited.
that's a good way to look at it. And
Yeah.
don't forget, here we're so close to the customer that you can make changes, almost real time. Whereas if you're trying to make
Hmm.
changes to your design in China or in Vietnam, you get like a 2 month lag because of the shipping.
Hmm. Yes, that's a good point. Now, I think anyone that follows the news and maybe follows like a deglobalization hashtag, even on social networks, they have probably heard of Apple moving some of their production to India and have probably thought, well, if Apple's doing it, then maybe I should do it too.
Okay.
The folks at folks at Apple are smart people, and I don't think they would move to India if they thought there was going to be problems producing electronics. So that brings up the question: does India also make sense if your goal as a company is to geographically diversify your production and your supply chain?
India is good. India seems to be a really good option for a lot of people. But there are a couple of downsides on India that we have to talk about. I have my notes here. Okay. India does not. I'm always wary of using Apple and Samsung as our test case, because these people are, like Tesla just
I,
made.
I I understand, but they're like the big ones that are visible, and so people look at them, and I think it's easy to kind of boil down their strategy to maybe something that might work sense at a smaller level. I agree with you that it doesn't always make sense.
India can be difficult. Maybe it's gotten better since I had my encounters. India hasn't been, and remember, I do international negotiation as my job. India is a tough one. It's tough to manage. The government is difficult. The labor situation is better, but they have unions and they have vocal proponents of their own interests. It doesn't. It's tough to manage, and it doesn't really cure all your geopolitical ills.
Sure.
It's um,
But maybe if you wanted to produce closer to Europe, if you're selling into the European market, does India make sense? Is India like the Mexico equivalent for Europe?
no, I think Eastern Europe is what the
Okay, so maybe Serbia would be better for
maybe
for
or Poland. I'm
for
not
Poland. Okay.
100% sure on that. India is an option, but again, it doesn't really. Right now I'm worried about political risk and geopolitical risk, and India is not going. It's going to be a half step. The same
Okay.
thing as I put India in the same category as Vietnam. If you've already done your negotiations, if you have a plant or you have a relationship already, fine. It will serve you well for a while, but in we live in very very unsettled geopolitical times, and there's a lot of there's a lot that can go wrong. So yeah, India. If I have nothing against India. I mean, I'm not going to raise any red flags there. Like in China, I know things are going to be bad. I know the costs
Okay.
are going up. India, I'm more of a wait and see kind of guy. I know that India is wants the business. I don't know for sure that they can do the business, and I'm not sure that in a year or two we won't be having similar problems with India that we're having with China.
Well, you just mentioned that China would be bad from the cost perspectives. I think you said costs are going to go up,
Yes.
and that's just been the broader trend regardless. I think India, when people look at India, they'd say, well, India makes sense for the technical skills,
Hmm.
but I think as the technical skills have gone up, that also pushes the cost up. So at some point, you're not necessarily looking at India as the lower cost option. There's got to be something else there that causes you to put your new production or assembly facility in India. And maybe the contrast is, can I actually sell into India if I'm going to put a factory in India? Is that going to be allowed? Whereas
Well,
Mexico, you can't really do that without paying duties.
um, I'm not 100% sure what the situation is like in India. The population's big. They're not, I don't know the size of the middle class there. Um, in Mexico, the middle class is growing to the point where costs are going up. We're starting to have a little bit too much of a good thing here in Mexico. There is a middle class market that's developing. They are used to paying the duty here. They're used to, right now it's either iPhones or Oppo or the Chinese brands. The Chinese brands pretty much own the market, the non-Apple, the non-iPhone market here in mobile. Um, I don't know. As far as production goes, I think, as far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out on India, because I haven't heard. I've heard good things, but I don't know if the verdict is in yet. On Mexico, I know that sophisticated multinational factories are producing at the same quality as they are in the United States. So
Okay, well that's comforting because that's another issue that comes up is quality control, and that's another news item that came out with Apple moving production to India is they were having
yes,
some quality issues.
yes,
So I think if you have that culture of quality like you have in Mexico, it makes it a lot easier to move production there, plan new production there, and be able to sleep at night.
yeah. That's a known. That's a given. That's known. When GM sets up a plant here, or when Caterpillar sets up a plant here, it's the expectation is that quality will be within the U.S. tolerances.
Sure,
And in
makes
some
sense.
cases, you know, I think it's GM has moved all their EV stuff down, the electric vehicle stuff down here. These are cutting edge factories that GM is building. I think it's GM. GM is doing the construction by their own standards. With people they know. So it's not going to be as much of a question mark as India seems to be. But
Sure.
that being said, I've heard good things about India as far as the quality of the factors. I just haven't seen it. I don't think it's really a known quantity yet. Um, and the distance bothers me.
Sure, sure. Well, we're running a little low on time, but I think as maybe a final thought, I just wanted to ask you, what would be some advice, given all of the stuff that we've talked about, what would be some advice that you would give to companies that are maybe planning new production in one of these areas that we have mentioned, or just planning to geographically diversify generally, whether it's electronics or whether it's part of all of the components that go into their assemblies?
Time is not on your side. It's already late, is what I would
Okay.
say. That's what I would say. In many parts of Mexico, they're at capacity already. Don't forget, the
Okay.
multinationals have been doing this for 5 years at least. The multinationals have been, splitting their supply chain. There's now a U.S. block supply chain and a China block supply chain, and the Western, the big multinationals have already taken up a lot of capacity, and they're building from the ground up here in Mexico, and they don't even have enough land to build on. I know from my time in Vietnam, they're not really looking to build small factories. Samsung was able to, create, but they had to build their own port. But Samsung was able to set up a giant operation in Vietnam. I don't know that there's that much excess capacity for contract manufacturing in Vietnam going forward. India, I'm not sure of. Thailand, I know is not, it's not as flexible as it used to be. People have been moving out of China, uh, and they've been doing that anyway because of costing. But since 2018, when our trade, our trade war, our trade kerfuffle started to develop, the multinationals had made the adjustments, and a lot of larger companies have already made the adjustment. So if you're still like saying, well, maybe Vietnam or maybe Mexico, I would invest in a couple of plane tickets, and I would investigate, and I would start to. The second thing I would say for the SMEs and for the small and medium sized businesses is develop a transitional strategy. Figure out a way to get your foot in the door. I would prefer it to be Mexico, but even Vietnam, you're going to have this. You're going to run into the same issues, where it's not going to be a quick adjustment. It's not going to be a matter of weeks. To transition into Mexico in a meaningful way, you're looking at 6 months to 2 years. I don't know the situation in India, but I would be surprised if everything was finalized without incident. This is going to be, I think, for a lot of, especially American companies still running supply chains through China, they're not. They think everything is going to run on China time. They think everything is running on Shenzhen time, and the rest of the world just doesn't work that way. So it's already late in the day. Figure out a transitional strategy and do a business environment analysis to figure out what is right for you. Don't listen to don't stop at the first piece of news, because again, China is one of the most over-analyzed markets and one of the most over-covered economies in the history of the world. But once you leave China, it's very hard to get usable business intelligence on these other places. And this is one of the things I've been finding in Mexico. It's very hard to get business intelligence on Mexico. That's one of the things people have me doing. And no one's ever going to be the factory of the world the way Shenzhen and Guangdong were, where you could just show up at the Canton Fair and spend a couple of days in this giant trade show and walk out with all your supply chain taken care of. That doesn't happen anywhere else, and it certainly doesn't happen in Mexico. So time is not on your side. You need a transition plan, and you're going to have to put in some legwork, or hire someone to put in the legwork.
Yeah, well, I think that's all very excellent advice. And hopefully as these trends continue and as the situation globally develops, we can have you back on to discuss more of these issues.
Good. Hopefully we'll see you down here in Mexico sometime soon.
Well, thank you very much. To everyone that's out there listening, we've been talking with Andrew Hupert, professor at Holt University and supply chain consultant. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure to hit the subscribe button, and you'll be able to keep up with all of our tutorials and episodes as they come out. And last but not least, don't stop learning, stay on track, and we will see you next time.